Hi, I'm Sarah Miro, and I'm going to be presenting the second part of Innovations in Heat Planning Research and Practice. In today's presentation, I want to start by talking about the importance of equity in planning for resilience to heat and other challenges. Second, I'll talk about the current status of heat planning in the US, drawing on a recent survey that Lad Keith, who you heard from earlier, and I conducted. And finally, I'll discuss innovative approaches to plan integration. I want to begin, though, by recognizing the moment that we're in. We have protests for racial injustice happening worldwide in the midst of a global pandemic. Meanwhile, heat waves and other weather and climate-related hazards are looming. And all of these intersecting crises are disproportionately impacting communities of color. So heat health planning, I would argue, is inevitably an equity issue. And heat vulnerability intersects with other historical and current injustices. So how do we start thinking about equity in heat planning? Well, some colleagues and I recently published a paper in which we developed a framework for what social equity means in the context of urban resilience planning, drawing on social and environmental justice theory. Our framework included distributional, recognitional, and procedural components. We then used this framework to analyze the first 10 resilience plans from North American cities that were developed as part of the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities program. And overall, what we found was that there was just a lot of variation in the extent to which these different plans were incorporating equity. So some never actually mentioned equity or justice at all. Others made it a major focus of the plan. But when plans did discuss equity, they tended to focus much more on equitable distribution of goods and services and opportunities, what is known as distributional equity, and much less on equitable participation in decision-making processes or procedural equity, including ways, for example, of how the cities reached out to marginalized communities. And least of all, they focused on recognitional equity. Now, recognitional equity is about acknowledging historical injustices and group differences and intersectionalities that continue to shape patterns of vulnerability today. So obviously this is very relevant, I think, in the context of what's happening, particularly here in the US right now with these protests. Now, cities have often not done a good job recognizing these issues, but Boston's resilience plan is actually a notable exception. It focuses explicitly on racial justice, including recognizing systemic racism and mapping vulnerable populations. You can see this from a few excerpts for the plan that I have pasted here on the slide. So now that we've established the fact that equity needs to be a crucial part of any kind of heat resilience or heat planning, I want to turn to the current status of heat planning. And I'll focus on some of the results from the survey that Lad and I conducted of US planners, which aim to understand how planners were thinking about or perceiving heat risks, the impacts that different communities were experiencing from extreme heat across the US, what information planners were using as they prepared for and addressed heat, what strategies they thought would be most effective and what were actually being implemented in different communities, and the barriers that they were facing in actually implementing these strategies. So we actually conducted this survey on two samples, one which we sent to specific planners in certain cities, and another which was a more generic link that we shared through our professional networks. And today I'm going to focus on presenting some preliminary results from this first targeted sample, which we focused on achieving a more representative and diverse sample of communities through. So what we did is we took a list of the 1,000 largest cities by population in the US, and we then stratified those in by population size and region, and then randomly selected cities from those groups to send our survey to. We ended up with a list of 111 cities of different sizes and from all regions of the US, and we ended up receiving completed surveys from 68 of those, an overall response rate of over 60%. So we were quite happy with that. So let's now talk a little bit about what some of the results of that survey are. So when it comes to heat risk perceptions, it seems that on the whole, the majority of respondents were either somewhat or very concerned about extreme heat impacts to the economy, the environment, health, as well as overall. And when we asked specifically whether they were more concerned about urban heat island heat effects or heat impacts from climate change, there seemed to be more focus or more concern about climate change. So we can see that a larger share of the respondents were either somewhat concerned or very concerned about climate change than they were the urban heat island. In terms of what parts of the community, what sectors had been impacted by heat already, we see that energy use and water use, followed by urban vegetation or tree canopy, and public health were some of the most commonly acknowledged impacts. In terms of what heat information planners are using to inform their work, the most commonly used sources were vegetation or tree maps, followed by heat indices, historical temperature data, and future projections and statistics. The least commonly used were actually future scenarios, and also heat vulnerability maps and land surface temperature maps were less used. And we asked also, as part of this question, for those information sources that they were not using, whether they were not using them because they didn't think they would be helpful or because they weren't available. And particularly heat vulnerability maps and land surface temperature maps, respondents said they weren't using because they weren't available. So this seems to be somewhat of a information gap for planners. We also asked respondents what they thought was the most appropriate jurisdiction for heat planning. So who should really be responsible for planning for extreme heat? Respondents were somewhat divided on this, so they seem to think that different levels of government should be responsible for this. Slightly more assigned responsibility primarily to the local level or city or town planning, followed by state, then national, county, and regional. In terms of the actual strategies that communities have implemented, the most common, over half of all respondents said that they had implemented urban forestry or tree canopy increases. The second most common was emergency response actions, then man-made shade structures, weatherization and retrofits, urban design, warning systems, etc. On the flip side, some of the least commonly implemented strategies, the least common was actually having a dedicated staff member who was responsible for heat, and also regulations were not very commonly implemented specifically to address extreme heat. And this is interesting. So then we, in addition to asking what strategies they'd actually implemented, we asked planners what strategies they thought would be most effective for addressing extreme heat. And here again, we see that urban forestry and tree canopy is on average, seen as the most effective of all the strategies, followed by urban design, weatherization and retrofits, and then emergency response. So we see there does seem to be some match between the strategies that planners think are most effective and what's being implemented, so that we can see as a positive sign. But whereas very few communities had actually had dedicated staff to deal with heat, quite a few respondents here thought that that would be quite effective. So we can see that's not the least effective strategy by any means. But interestingly, regulations were seen as the least effective. But to be fair, across the board, all of these different strategies received somewhat reasonably high or moderately high effectiveness scores. So there were no strategies that across the board, no planners seem to think would actually be effective at addressing heat. And so this suggests that we do have a fairly large portfolio of strategies that we could be implementing for heat. Now, given that we have all of these strategies, what are the barriers to actually implementing them? Because we've seen some of this mismatch. Well, overwhelmingly, it seems that funding, time, and staff, so really resources, seem to be a major problem. There also respondents also said that there were other higher priority issues, leadership issues, public support. What we can see here is that across the board, almost all of these barriers were seen as at least a slight barrier, most seen as actually somewhat of a barrier on average. So there do seem to be a number of significant challenges for effective heat planning in the US. We also wanted to see what kinds of plans cities were implementing heat strategies in, because it's very rare for communities to actually have a dedicated standalone heat plan. So we asked this, and what we found was that the most common were sustainability, climate, and resilience plans, followed by emergency response plans, comprehensive plans, hazard mitigation plans, and actually the least common was zoning code and regulations for actually implementing heat strategies or specifically addressing heat. And this is consistent with the previous finding that regulations were not seen as particularly effective and were not being commonly implemented. Now, recognizing again that cities don't typically have standalone heat plans, which again was confirmed, and our survey shows that heat strategies are integrated into many other types of plans. We've argued that, or I would argue that you need to assess a city's heat resilience efforts, not in any individual plan, but across a full network of plans. This means considering how policies in, for example, the general or comprehensive plan, economic development plan, small area plans, et cetera, all interact. And to give an example of why this is important, you might have a hazard mitigation plan that would suggest increasing open spaces in the hottest areas of the city, but then you might have a downtown development plan that emphasizes density. And so what we see is that plans have an opportunity to actually work together. If policies are synergistic, then they could have a greater impact on actually addressing multiple hazards or addressing heat. They could also just be disconnected and not actually working in coordination, or worst of all, they could actually have conflicting policies. And so recognizing this challenge, the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard, or PIRS approach, was developed by Dr. Phil Burke and colleagues originally at Texas A&M University. And this approach was specifically focused on addressing this problem, or assessing how policies that impact vulnerability to hazards are integrated across a community's full network of plans. And you can find a detailed guidebook for the PIRS approach online, but I wanted to briefly describe the steps that are involved in this approach, drawing on a sort of mini case study that I've recently been collaborating on with some colleagues as part of a larger collaborative research project. This is focused specifically on flood resilience planning, and the case study is of the city of Boston. And particularly for this case study, we'll focus just on two plans. Climate Ready Boston, their city's sort of climate adaptation plan, and their hazard mitigation plan. But of course, in a typical Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard, you would look at a greater number of plans. So the first step for that is to actually identify all of the relevant community plans. So again, here, just looking at two of them, but there are many others in the city of Boston that we actually assess for this larger project. Once you have all of your plans, then you need to look at the city and divide it up into some kind of meaningful planning districts, and actually map out which areas in those districts are exposed to the hazard that you're focusing on, or hazards. For example, in this case study, we're looking at flooding. So we map out the areas within the planning districts that are within FEMA's 100-year flood zone to get a sense of the current flood risk areas, and then also the NOAA 2100 sea level rise projection areas, so get a sense of future flood risk. Then you actually go back to those plans and you pull out all of the spatially explicit, or in other words, mappable policies, which would affect vulnerability to flooding or to a hazard. And then you score them with either a -1 or a +1 based on whether they would negatively or positively impact vulnerability to flooding. So here you can see two examples of policies from these two plans from the city of Boston, both of which get a +1 score because they would improve vulnerability to flooding. Then once you've scored all of the policies and assigned them to these different district planning zones, you actually add up all of the policy scores for each district hazard zone for each plan. And this allows you then to compare across plans to see where their policies are either increasing or decreasing vulnerability to flooding, and also to look across the entire network of plans to see how the city is doing in terms of its policies. Now, the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard has actually recently been adopted by the American Planning Association, and they're going to be developing resources and guidance for that, for communities to actually implement this across the US. I think that this process of research is coming out that suggests that it can help communities to, again, connect different planning efforts, which are often conducted in silos, and to help to make policies more streamlined and to avoid these kind of conflicts that I've talked about. Now, the PIRS approach was originally developed for flooding, but with Lad Keith and Dr. Phil Burke, we've been discussing and are moving forward with plans to actually pilot it for heat. And I think this is going to be really interesting because unlike flooding, heat actually has no formal governance structure. You don't typically see heat plans or regulations, as we've discussed. And so it will be really interesting to try to actually see how different networks of plans are addressing heat or increasing or reducing vulnerability related to heat. Challenge to this, of course, though, is going to be figuring out what those heat hazard zones are going to look like in the districts, since we don't actually have universal FEMA flood districts for heat. There's many different ways of assessing it and mapping it, of course. And so this is, I think, a future opportunity area, but really just in initial stages. So, in conclusion, equity needs to be at the center of heat planning. I hope I've made that clear, and that includes not just distributional equity, but also procedural and recognitional equity. Most planners, at least, are somewhat concerned about heat, our survey suggests, especially related to climate change. Some of the most common heat impacts are to energy and water use, vegetation and health in the US. Vegetation maps, heat indices, historical temperatures were some of the most common heat information that planners used or reported using. Urban forestry tree canopy was the most common and also seen as the most effective strategy for addressing heat, according to the planners in our survey. A few cities had dedicated staff for dealing with heat, but we see that staff time is really seen as a barrier. And conversely, planners thought that actually having staff who worked on heat would be a fairly effective strategy. And while heat is addressed in a wide variety of city plans, the most common of those are sustainability, climate action, or resilience plans. And because of this, we need to integrate heat across the network of plans or think about how we're addressing heat in policies across many different plans. And this plan integration for resilience scorecard approach, I think, is a promising methodology that we could use to actually do this. So now, just to end with a few brief sort of takeaways for practice based on the presentations you've seen. So first, I think when you're thinking about heat planning, it's important to really assess the governance structure to identify point people in relevant areas. This includes public health, planning, emergency management, etc. You need to assess the available data sources that are relevant for urban heat. This includes environmental health maps, things that are related to equity, urban heat island maps, climate projections, thermal comfort maps, social vulnerability, etc. We need to think across a network of plans. So this includes hazard mitigation plans, climate plans, resilience plans, comprehensive plans, etc. And we need to identify and assess what are the most relevant strategies or actions or policies that communities can take to combat heat. So for example, what kind of design interventions, cool corridors, emergency response actions, or urban forestry or vegetation is most effective at actually addressing heat. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.